Michelle, and today I wanted to talk about Shakespeare. As you can tell from the title, Shakespeare for the Timid Reader, and I think that's the best title to give this because this video is intended for anyone who thought that they might like to give Shakespeare a shot and maybe they're intimidated by it, anyone considering taking a Shakespeare course, and I have my personal strategy that I think is a really good way to start. I will discuss that and give an example with one piece of his work. A little background. Last semester I took an Introduction to Shakespeare course and I absolutely loved it, but I was very timid about it. I was really nervous. There was a few things that I thought that we were going to have to be expected to know, such as I knew there was going to be a ton of reading, and in my other classes that were for my degree program, they had tons of reading. I was also nervous about the language that Shakespeare uses because it's very old. I don't want to say Old English because it's not Old English. Forgot exactly what it is, but I think it's called like Middle English or something. Either way, it's foreign to us in modern day. I didn't understand poetry. I really used to like to write poems as a little kid, but as I was getting older and reading more mature poetry, I don't understand poetry. I really don't, and I would love to, so I was really nervous about having to understand those kinds of things. After taking this course, all those things that I was really nervous about were not even an issue, so I'm really excited to share that with you. In this course, I learned so much about history and other topics that aren't necessarily Shakespeare-based, but I think it's really important in learning those things to understanding Shakespeare more in-depthly and enjoying it. So one of the first questions that we are asked is, why is Shakespeare so important? Why has he lasted for 400 years and still regarded as one of the greatest literary people? Oh my gosh, I'm like totally messing myself up here. And I also have to point out, I didn't actually put this in my notes, but I do have to point out that although we are very familiar with Shakespeare and that he is a playwright, in his day, it was a really big business for so many people. There was tons of playwrights constantly competing against each other. Moving on. Okay, so again, why is Shakespeare so important? Well, there's not really a quick and easy answer to this question. Shakespeare can be important to each individual person for different reasons. We may all have our own different reasons for wanting to read Shakespeare, but what I personally have found is that Shakespeare has such an incredible insight into the nature of human behavior, actions, motivations. Studying Shakespeare is also really historical. Through my discussions in class, I kept comparing the things or the topics that he was discussing into the life in England at that time, and what people at that time, for instance, thought about witches or witchcraft and how it was regarded then and how we see things now. That was really fun to see myself thinking in those terms even just as I was reading. One of the biggest reasons I think people are intimidated by Shakespeare are their reservations with poetry and Shakespeare's language. I'm actually going to call this a misconception. You do not need to understand iambic pentameter to enjoy Shakespeare's works. Never once in my class were we ever expected to understand those things. Now, the language barrier is definitely a valid reason to fear Shakespeare, but fear no more, I have a solution. My professor was completely okay with me using the No Fear Shakespeare versions. My class was a 10-week course instead of a 15-week course, and we read about 6 plays, I think. Sonnets, and I'm not sure if this is considered just a poem, but we also read Venus and Adonis. Sorry, I'm not sure how to say that. Adonis, Venus and Adonis. In addition to reading those, we were also expected to watch the play, since Shakespeare's plays were intended to be heard and not read. Other assignments we had were weekly discussions with a very strict word count. We had to meet a minimum word count. I ended up writing double every discussion because I just had so many thoughts and feels about what was going on in the play. We also had 3 essay projects, and with every assignment we were expected to have some sort of quotation from the text. Also, I forgot to add, we also had a journal project, and we only had to turn it in twice, but for every play we had to answer another discussion question in a journal format. So it was a lot of work, and a lot of reading and a lot of writing, and one of our essay topics we had to do a huge research project. I ended up doing mine on Lord Chamberlain's Men. So I really, honestly, I didn't have time to do all of that. let alone just try to get through the text and read it in the original language. So I did the no fear version and I still got an A, so it works. You get what you need out of it. And personally, I feel like when you're trying to read the original text and you're not gonna understand understand half of it, then you're not understanding the story. And that's really the reason why we love Shakespeare so much, is for the story that's behind it. Don't feel bad if you don't want to read the original text. Get the story. That's where the meat of it is anyways. Next on my list I want to talk about is how to make Shakespeare more enjoyable. I would do a little research on the life in England in those times, who the monarchs were, what was going on. Like at this time the plague was ravaging the country. You know, what was the world like around him? Where did Shakespeare get his inspiration? So I'll give you a little bit of what was most interesting to me about the history. And I'm actually going to just read this, so if I'm looking down, I really like how I prepared my notes to do this video, so I'm just gonna read this. Shakespeare lived in England in a place called Stratford upon Avon, about 100 miles north of London. He was born in April 1564 and he died in April of 1616. Queen Elizabeth I ruled England for most of Shakespeare's life. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. This era was called the Elizabethan era. It's interesting to know her influence on the playwrights and her censorship. During this time, the plague ravaged England as well. So there's a lot of loss and tragedy just in everyday life. Towards the end of Queen Elizabeth's life, the Scottish James VI moved to England and befriended Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth had never married or had children to pass the crown to, so she gave it to James, who became James I of England. He ruled England and Scotland, but always stayed in England. He was so incredibly impressed with the plays, he took a theater company called the Lord Chamberlains Men, which Shakespeare was a member of. Member or patron, I'm not sure. It's been a little bit since I've done my paper. He turned the Lord Chamberlain's Men into the King's Men. He financed the company as long as he could call upon them to perform at court whenever he liked or whenever he wanted to entertain. So that's kind of a good starting point. And if you want to learn more about the history, I strongly encourage it. It's super fun and super interesting to learn about, and I've left a lot of links down below for other resources. Moving on, I wanted to kind of get into my strategy and my recommendations on going into your first piece of Shakespeare. So the next thing I would recommend is to decide which play that you want to start with. Decide if it's a tragedy, a comedy, a historical, or what have you. Read the synopsis and get really familiar with the characters. Most books will have this in it. My professor called it something, but I'm not sure. In my book, my No Fear Shakespeare, it just says characters. I really like the character section in these No Fear versions because I have another parallel text, but they don't really discuss each character in depth like they do in this book. I mean, there's a really nice long paragraph on who they are, what their role is. Read that first. I tried skipping it and I kept having to go back anyways when I kind of get lost in the story and be like, wait, who was that guy again? And so I'd have to go back and read it anyways. So get really familiar, and you probably still have to go back to refresh your memory on like, wait, where are they from? Are they from Scotland? Are they from England? Like, so yeah, get really familiar with the characters. It's a good idea before you start to look up the themes, what to expect in the play, and I'll discuss themes a little bit more later. Next up, we get the No Fear version of the text, or a parallel text is fine too, but these are really, really great. I started with these, and I just really love how clear they're written. The format of the book I think is really nice as well, and they're really small and easy to stick in your bag wherever you go. Get your sticky notes, a pen, a highlighter, and start reading your play. When you're done reading your play, follow up with it. Ask yourself critical questions. I also have linked below a couple of links based on Macbeth. I'm going to use this as my example. This part was the most essential part to really understanding what I was reading. I really loved it, and I really strongly suggest. It's a lot easier when your professor gives you the questions to answer than being self-motivated and seeking out what questions. It's a really wonderful tool to really dive into the text and really understand the characters. So I'm going to use Macbeth for my example, and I'm going to go through my steps with this piece. So my first tip was to decide which play you wanted to start out with. I chose Macbeth for my example. My second tip was to determine what genre it fell into. So Macbeth is a tragedy, and the full title is The Tragedy of Macbeth. I wanted to know what time this was written, and Wikipedia tells me it is approximately performed first in 1606, and I want to note that this play was done in the Jacobean era, and I thought that this is actually kind of interesting because Shakespeare has been known to write tributes to the monarch in his work. My next tip was to identify the themes that you should be looking for. Wikipedia told me that the play dramatizes the damaging physical and psychological effects of political ambition on those who seek power. Power being the key word here. Other themes I found on another website was prophecy, guilt and remorse, ambition, temptation, salvation, and damnation, and of course power. You're gonna go get your play. So always on the left side of the page in the black box, this is the original text, and then over here is the exact text in plain English. Go ahead and read it now. As you can see, I have a bunch of flags in here, and I have something randomly highlighted here. I just wanted to read that for you. I highlighted, Macbeth says, "I won't let my eye look at what my hand is doing, but in the end, I'm still going to do that thing I'd be horrified to see." And then I have a note next to that. This shows his guilt. He feels completely out of control. I don't want to give away too much. This is one of my top favorites. So I read that in the plain English version, and I'm going to actually read it in the original text for you too, and you can see how vastly different. "The eye wink at the hand, yet let that be which the eye fears when it is done to see." Just as an example. In Macbeth specifically, to me it stood out the most in Macbeth, while it is brought up in other pieces of his work. But in this one particularly, I had to go look at the history of witches in England. Another reason to understand when it was written, because as I said, it was written under King James when King James took over England. He actually was notorious for leading huge witch hunts all over England. It's really interesting to know that going into this because they discuss witches in here. You meet them at the very, very beginning. They're like the three weird sisters. They tell Macbeth this prophecy, which end up leading him on a path of destruction. It's interesting to see that, like, in those times witches were feared. So after you're done reading, go back to your themes. And what do you think? Did you pick up on the themes? Were you able to identify them? Ask yourself these really critical questions. After that, watch a production. I've also linked a free resource called Play Shakespeare, I think. It has tons of links to, I think you do have to sign up with an account, but it has links to productions of the play. And then go watch a movie. There's tons of movie renditions. Again, it's linked below, an IMDb link, and it has a whole list of all the Macbeth movie renditions. I also left a link to the No Fear website. So if you don't want to go buy the book, although personally, especially with Shakespeare, I like that I can flag pages, highlight in them, and write in them. But if you don't want to do that and you want to do it free, you can go to the No Fear website and read the full text for free. The plays that I've read in class, and those are the only ones I've read so far. I think the next one I'm going to pick up is Othello. I'm hoping to get that in this month, but we'll see. So at the very end of the course, we were asked to list our plays from most liked to least favorite. My most liked was Measure for Measure, then King Lear, Macbeth, Hamlet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and then Henry V at the bottom. Henry V was a historical, and I thought it was the most boring piece ever, so I probably wouldn't start with that. I would probably recommend starting with Measure for Measure, King Lear, or Macbeth. One of my top three. Hamlet, a lot of people couldn't get into that in class. I personally couldn't get into it very well either because it is a lot slower moving. The top three, they get into the action really quick. They're really quick. I buzzed through like one of these plays in like a half a day. They're really engaging, so I would really recommend starting with one of those. Anyways, I guess that wraps up my discussion, my little intro discussion to Shakespeare. I would love to hear your thoughts, so if you want to comment below, let me know which one's your favorites. Was this video helpful? I would really love to know your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to any commentary, and I'll see you next time. Bye!